BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays this year I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And today is a double event. To use some Whitechapel terminology, there will be 2 episodes about Jack the Ripper. Last week on the channel, I was talking about the book The Bell Tower by Robert Graysmith, which explores George Gibson as a Jack the Ripper suspect. And as I was reading up on him, I found that there are 2 suspects named John Gibson, or at least have John Gibson in their name. There's George Gibson and Andrew John Gibson, and I will be discussing both of them here in this episode. So this is the double event within a double event. And to be fair to Robert Graysmith, his Jack the Ripper theory is that Jack the Ripper was actually a team of 2 people, George Gibson, who had the nickname Jack, and Jesse Gibson, who was not a blood relative, though, just the same last name. And I would like to go over to casebook.org, which has a write-up on the suspect and a profile for George Gibson as a Jack the Ripper suspect. John Gibson was named as a Jack the Ripper suspect by Robert Graysmith in his book The Bell Tower. Graysmith makes the claim that Theo Durant, a 24-year-old medical student who was arrested and found guilty and executed on January 7th of 1898 for the murder of 2 women, Blanche Lamont and Minnie Williams, in San Francisco's Baptist Church, was in fact innocent of the crime, and the real culprit was George Gibson, a church pastor. Robert Graysmith goes on to claim that Gibson was also responsible for the Whitechapel murders. Graysmith claims that Gibson was in London when the murders occurred and left shortly after. George Gibson was born in Edinburgh on August 14th of 1859, and at the time of the Whitechapel murders he would have been 29 years of age, 5 feet 9 inches tall, fair-haired, small sandy mustache, well-built and broad-shouldered. According to the San Francisco News, George Gibson confessed on his deathbed to Charlie Floyd in the spring of 1912 that it was he and not Theo Durant who murdered Blanche Lamont and Minnie Williams. Fortunately, the person Gibson supposedly confessed to, Charlie Floyd, never actually existed, and it appears to be a hybrid of several different people. There is no evidence that Gibson was in London at the time of the Ripper murders, and it is believed that he was serving at a church in Scotland. While Graysmith produces no evidence that Gibson was responsible for the Whitechapel murders, he also provides no evidence that Gibson perpetrated the murders in San Francisco's Baptist Church either, or that the perpetrator, Theo Durant, was actually innocent of the crimes. Well, casebook.org is taking a very strong stance against George Gibson being a Jack the Ripper suspect. But let's actually discuss some of this content. Before I went into the Bell Tower, what I would have known about that book is that it claims that George Gibson was Jack the Ripper. He had an accomplice named Jesse Gibson, and he was born in Scotland. Then he first goes to England, then he makes his way to North America, going towards San Francisco. So, one point, though, that I've never really liked about some of these critics is they insist that Jack the Ripper could not have been living outside of London. They think that Jack the Ripper would have had to have been living in London, had to have lived in Whitechapel, and I'm just like, why? I know they think it's because the Ripper had intense familiarity with the back streets of Whitechapel, but I don't think that it's an absolute necessity. Now, is somebody going to be traveling down from Scotland every so often to commit these crimes? Well, I don't know how plausible that would have been, but at the same time, Graysmith's claim is that George Gibson is going first from Scotland down to England. Now, let's look here, though. He would have been 29 years old at the time of the Whitechapel murders. That is appropriate. I mean, a lot of the psychological profiles, partnered with what little we know about the Ripper's physical appearance, could easily indicate someone who is in his late 20s and early 30s, 29. I think that works. Now, as far as being 5 feet 9 inches tall, again, we have very, very mild descriptions of the Jack the Ripper suspects. Sometimes they estimate around 5'5", 5'6", maybe people who caught a quick glimpse of the Ripper, but as we all know, there are no definitive composite sketches of the Ripper, and there are no solid witness sightings. I mean, even if somebody like George Hutchinson got a good look at a man walking with Mary Kelly, the final victim of Jack the Ripper, on November 9th of 1888, that doesn't mean that that person actually was the Ripper. I mean, so many things about that story are questionable. But another point here, though, is just that it seems like there is a little bit of storytelling going on, but Graysmith has a very, very big set of theories in his Jack the Ripper claims. Number one, he claims that there were two people that were participating in the murder of Martha Tabram. One of them was right-handed and one of them was left-handed. She was stabbed 38 times by one person, and then another person took the knife and stabbed her an additional time. That's a little bit harder to believe, but there's one that I would like to challenge a little bit more strongly. That is that Robert Graysmith is going to include the murder of Annie Millwood into his Jack the Ripper theory. And I'll be fair, it's the attack on Annie Millwood. As I said when I was reading the book The Facts, or Jack the Ripper, The Facts by Paul Begg, that states very clearly that Annie Millwood was attacked in early 1888, but she passed away about a month after her attack due to a ruptured pulmonary artery and something similar to a bleeding ulcer. She had health conditions, and she was in her late 30s at the time, but she passed away because of different unrelated medical issues. Annie Millwood was attacked, though, and some people don't even believe that there was a different assailant. They think that her wounds might have been self-inflicted for some odd reason based on the nature of the attack. I'm not even 100% sure there was a perpetrator, but to say that that was Jack the Ripper related is very difficult, and you can hear more about that in my episode on the London of Jack the Ripper, where I was discussing the book of that name by Richard Jones. There's a very big portrayal of Annie Millwood in that book. But I told you guys that I was going to be talking about two different Jack the Ripper suspects within this episode, and the next one will be Andrew John Gibson. Just a final note on George Gibson as a Jack the Ripper suspect. Even though he might match some of the physical descriptions and details, I think that I have to side with Casebook and say that it appears that there's just not going to be enough to connect him to the crime scenes, partnered with these odd observations about the two people working in tandem, trying to confuse the authorities, or that they're both participating, taking stabs with a knife. I think all of that is unsubstantiated. Now, I found out about Andrew John Gibson because I was reading up on the first John Gibson, and he is somebody who was a real-life con man. And I've just noticed that as I've been reading through the Jack the Ripper stories, you find that there are real criminals that are involved with this. I mean, you even have people like Francis Tumblety, the Quack Doctor, as well as people who are real murderers like William Henry Bury, let alone other serial killers like George Chapman, who was the Burrow poisoner. But with Andrew John Gibson, he is going to be someone who was a con man, and I've read through several different articles, and the absolute best one was from In the Hills magazine that has a very extensive write-up on him. I mean, it's just filled with responses to the original news coverage, and they even post the original news articles so you can see in the images, and then they have write-ups and responses. And this was written by Andre Babine, just citing the source from In the Hills magazine. The Love Pirate. Dufferin County was briefly home to Andrew John Gibson, an Australian who became one of the most well-known conmen and bigamists of the 20th century. In the late 19th century, in rural Mulmer Township, figured fleetingly in the criminal career of Andrew John Gibson, who left a trail of misdeeds and broken hearts across the United States and the British Empire. Some even claim that this charlatan may have been the infamous Jack the Ripper. Dufferin County was briefly home to Andrew John Gibson, an Australian who became one of the most well-known conmen and bigamists of the 20th century. Gibson may have used as many as 40 aliases, but residents of Mulmer Township knew him as Dr. Henry Westwood Cooper. Dr. Henry Westwood Cooper, such a strong English-sounding name. Yeah, it's fake. Andrew John Gibson was born in Australia in 1868, but spent his years in England, returning to Australia when he was 20 years old. Well, I mean, that's going to be really borderline for Jack the Ripper then, because if he's born in 1868 and Jack the Ripper operated in 1888, then he only would have been 20 years old. So that's a little bit young to be Jack the Ripper. And is he just going to commit the Whitechapel murders and then head back to Australia immediately? I mean, that provides an explanation about why the crimes would have stopped. I will give them that one. The young man used his time in England to his good advantage, often claiming to be a member of the British aristocracy or attached to the royal family. An expert forger, Gibson was known for drafting false checks, cables, family trees, credentials, and official letters. explaining that he was due absurd amounts of money. One of the ultimately unsuccessful attempts illustrates Gibson's skill as well as his audacity. In 1925, he was arrested after passing documents authorizing payment from the South Australian Treasury. The documents appeared to have been signed by South Australia's Minister for Lands, and Gibson was caught only because he passed identical notes at two banks at once. The judge in the trial said that he was a first-rank forger. There are also reports that Gibson was in his 20s. When Gibson was in his 20s, he posed as Baron Chadwick and duped a widow in Sydney out of her savings, escaping conviction only on a technicality. In 1891, Gibson married Frances Mary Scully, then 21 years old. The 2-year difference in their ages was the least of anyone's worries. He seemed to prefer much younger women, or perhaps he just found them easier to manipulate. What happened to Scully is not clear, but most reports refer to Helen Scott, the 15-year-old Gibson married in 1895 as his first wife, and a year later the fraud artist married Bertha Young, and the two set sail for England. So it sounds like he's one of these guys who's marrying multiple women, he's trying to cheat them, and he is more or less just a giant Australian con man. But I mean, I'm not going to lie to you guys, I'm zoning in on the Jack the Ripper aspects of this case, and I think that this is quite similar to the story of Frederick Bailey Deeming, another Jack the Ripper suspect that has an Australian connection. Frederick Bailey Deeming is someone else who is a real-life murderer who goes on to be a Ripper suspect, and he's even referred to as Australia's Jack the Ripper. But I have a standalone episode on him, but I'm going to have to do a larger book discussion on that story because I really want to give it justice, and there are several books that have been written about not only Frederick Deeming as a Jack the Ripper suspect, but also about the crimes that he committed, and I would like to do a bigger exploration on that for Ripper Wednesday in the future. And in addition to Ripper Wednesday, I also do a segment about the Zodiac Killer every Monday, and one about D.B. Cooper every Friday. And for the summer, I'm coming to you guys live, talking about true crime every Tuesday and Thursday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. True Crime Talk Radio in the morning with me, Black Box Ned. And if you want to follow along with all of these discussions, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And you can also go through some of the links in the description box. One of them is for buymeacoffee.com. Buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And back to the article here from In the Hills. They say that Andrew John Gibson also used the aliases Charles Ernest Chadwick, Charles Edward Chadwick, Sir Harry Westwood Cooper, Harry Westwood Cooper, M.D. Those two are practically the same, though. Well, I guess it's Sir Harry versus Dr. Harry, Dr. Milton Abraham, Walter Thomas Porio, and that's actually his most famous alias, I think, based on some of the other articles, and Cecil Darling. So, as far as his connections, though, to the Ripper case, this seems a little bit skimpy, and all of these reasons why they would suspect him is just simply that he was a criminal who was moving about between England and Australia. And as I said, there is like a solid explanation as to how and why he would have stopped committing crimes in Whitechapel, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Andrew John Gibson was Jack the Ripper. But there's a different article that's been written about him in the Sydney Morning Herald, and it's called, Is Jack the Ripper Buried in Brisbane? And this was written by Penny Brand, and it was written in 2008. And I've noticed that there are a lot of articles that were written about Andrew John Gibson in 2008. We see this very frequently with other true crime cases. When I read older Zodiac news articles, there can be an explosion of popularity for a particular suspect. In around 2002, so many tabloid publications were talking about the Zodiac Killer may have been identified as a criminal named Bill Menser, who was a real-life murderer, but he was not a very strong Zodiac Killer suspect. And then, of course, we saw a media explosion in 2021 with articles about Gary Francis Post surfacing, and with the Ripper case, it's no different. With the Ripper case, it really doesn't appear to be anything that is, well, to the contrary at all. Sometimes there will be a Jack the Ripper suspect that will make his way into the world of media, and people will discuss him very frequently, whether it's Charles Lechmere or Chaim Hyams. Those are ones that have been discussed very frequently in the recent years. But let's go to this article, Is Jack the Ripper Buried in Brisbane? A Brisbane cemetery may be the resting place of one of the most notorious homicide suspects of all time, Jack the Ripper. On the eve of the 120th anniversary of the first murders of the 5 prostitutes in the London's Whitechapel area, keen ripperologists have made the chilling claim that Jack the Ripper may have been buried in the Toowong Cemetery in Brisbane, Australia. They claim that the man, known as Walter Thomas Porio, was actually Andrew John Gibson. The headstone where he was buried in 1952 doesn't even mention his name. Instead it reads, Bessie, died June 25th, 1957, and her husband. I guess that's another alias that he's ending up using. Bessie's husband. What a lousy end for the Ripper. A grainy image of the headstone depicting a caped man raising a dagger adds to the mystery. Well, I mean, that is something. If anything, that gives you a little bit of a cause for a suspicion. Porio was a convicted killer fraudster who had 20 wives and was buried at Toowong Cemetery by his last wife, Eliza, who was known as Bessie. He lived in London when all 5 murders were committed and sailed to Australia after the murders stopped. And as I said, that's a strong point. You have to give credit where credit is due. The latest Brisbane theory is one of hundreds about the identity of the never-caught killer, who went on a brutal rampage through London for 5 months in 1888. Well, I don't really accept that. I mean, we have August, September, October, November, and it's August 31st, to be honest. Really, it's about, 3 months and a day, if we're going to be fair, but it's over a span of 4 months. Brisbane historian and Ipswich City Councillor Paul Tully said the latest claim is sketchy in detail. Yes, I agree, but I do appreciate when people are leaving no stone unturned, because Jack the Ripper has never been identified. So if they are examining somebody, whether it's George Gibson or Andrew John Gibson, it's just look into these people and see what the claim is. All of the theories are based on circumstantial evidence and a lot of supposition, he said. That's why another theory comes out. I don't think this is Jack the Ripper, but it can't be ruled out. Tully said they were exhuming the grave for DNA, but that would be inappropriate, so they decided not to. I don't know that digging up people on a speculative basis would be appropriate. I mean, I think that if you actually had a very strong reason to suspect that, but how valid is the Ripper DNA? I mean, it appears that there have been a couple of claims related to mitochondrial DNA, maybe from the letters or from the very famous Shoal, as reported by Russell Edwards, but I just don't even know if we even have the Ripper's DNA. It is possible we might find out one day who Jack the Ripper was. It is equally possible that we will never know. Porio joins Frederick Deeming, who was hanged in Melbourne in 1898 for killing his wife, another Australian link to the Jack the Ripper mystery. And as far as these crimes go, we just have to remember that there are other murderers out there. There are other people like con men, such as Andrew John Gibson, and just because they committed a set of crimes in this way does not mean that they were responsible for other crimes. Like, say, for example, somebody whom I mentioned, like George Chapman, is the Burrow poisoner. Yeah, he was a real serial killer, but that doesn't mean that he was responsible for the Whitechapel murders. Thomas Neal Cream, as well, was also a poisoner and serial killer, the Lambeth poisoner. Doesn't mean he was responsible for the Whitechapel murders. What I'm trying to say is more than one tragedy can take place, as terrible as that sounds. And there's another article that has been written about Andrew John Gibson, and as I said, a lot of them come from 2008. This is in the Daily Mail. Was Jack the Ripper a Londoner with 20 wives who fled to Australia? Well, as we've seen very clearly, Andrew John Gibson was Australian. The only clue to the possible sinister identity of the body lying 6 feet under a headstone, carrying a grainy image of a caped figure raising a dagger. But in this Australian plot, the epitaph says Bessie, 1957, and her husband. Some historians believe that this is the body of Jack the Ripper. As the 120th anniversary of the first 5 murders by Jack the Ripper in London's Whitechapel was remembered, experts said that it was possible that this con man named Andrew John Gibson was responsible for the crimes. Andrew John Gibson also used the alias Walter Thomas Porio, and he had lived in London when all 5 murders took place. After the murder stopped, he had a colorful background, a convicted killer, imposter, and fraudster who had no less than 20 wives, and was buried amid a family shame beneath the stone. His faithful last wife Eliza was known as Bessie Porio, and they were married in 1952 on a hill with views of Brisbane. Many Ripper fanatics continue to debate the true identity of Jack the Ripper, and some are convinced that there is strong evidence implicating Andrew John Gibson in the string of prostitute murders, the habitual bigamist who broke many hearts and also tricked banks out of large sums of money. But he managed to create confusion about his background, so by the time he died when he was in his 80s, he was only listed as being 59 years old. I even think that it's weird to think about Jack the Ripper living into the 1950s, but it's mathematically possible. So one thing I'm noticing, though, is these news articles are saying, oh, well, there's this evidence that is going to connect Andrew John Gibson to the Ripper case, but they're not actually saying what it is, other than just there's this dagger on his headstone, this image of the cloaked dagger figure. But, they really aren't even making a very strong case. But I think that, let's just carry on here. The cat and mouse game. The killer taunted the 19th century police with a series of letters which gave details of the killings and claimed that they would continue. We know that's a fair thing to say about Jack the Ripper, but the Ripper's most widely discussed letters weren't actually mailed to the police, maybe indirectly taunting the police, but they were mailed to the Central News Agency at first. Then we have the From Hell letter, which is mailed to George Lust, the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, and then we even have things like the Openshaw letter, which was mailed to Dr. Thomas Openshaw. So yes, the Ripper might have been taunting the police with letters, if he did indeed write them, but it would have had to have been in an indirect way. Historians admit that the only link to Porio, aka Andrew John Gibson, was the fact that he was in London when the murders occurred, and he sailed to Australia, then the murders stopped. Now, this is something, though, that if that's really just the case that they're trying to make, you've heard how skimpy these articles are. If that's just the case that they're trying to make, I've said this once on Black Box Online Radio, and I'll say it again. I don't want to hear about what someone did not do. As we're going to see with countless Jack the Ripper suspects that have been examined, just because somebody leaves England and the murders stop, that doesn't mean they were Jack the Ripper. Well, how about Robert Graysmith's suspect, George Gibson? He goes from Scotland to England to San Francisco. He's also out of England and the murders have stopped. How about somebody like Montague John Druitt, who's an even more widely discussed suspect because he commits suicide and then there are no more Jack the Ripper murders? Allegedly, of course. The Whitechapel murders will continue into 1891, and if that's the case, to people who think that crimes such as perhaps the murder of Francis Coles were actually the Ripper, then Andrew John Gibson is not your man. There have been hundreds of theories about the identity of Jack the Ripper, among the strongest being Montague John Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, and Michael Ostrog. No, those are not the strongest suspects. Those are the three suspects that were mentioned in Melville MacNaughton's memorandum, and that was written in 1894, but I would hardly call those the three strongest suspects. Crime novelist Patricia Cornwell claimed in her book Portrait of a Killer that German-born artist Walter Sickert was the Ripper, but she based this mostly on seeing misogyny in his art and her belief that the taunting letters were from the killer and they were written by him. And this article concludes by saying Sickert is not considered a serious suspect by most who study the case, and there is strong evidence to suggest that he was in France at the time of the Ripper murders. And I have an episode about Patricia Cornwell's book, Portrait of a Killer, here on this channel. I also have a standalone episode about Walter Sickert as a Jack the Ripper suspect. I invite you to listen to those. But overall, what do you really think about these two suspects? George Gibson and Andrew John Gibson. No disrespect to any of the Gibsons out there, but I think that these cases are very flimsy for both of them. And a lot of it's based on their movements. A lot of it's based on the fact that people did travel internationally. People did move about the world because it was easier to do so, and they weren't dealing with things like visa processes. And I think that it's possible, and I'm going off of a hunch on this, that people wanted to make a media splash for the 120th anniversary of Jack the Ripper. So they're just like, oh my goodness, look at this headstone that's in Brisbane, Australia, and it has somebody with a dagger on it, and he was a real-life criminal, and he was in England at the time. Okay, boom, therefore he has to have been Jack the Ripper. I'm not convinced of that at all. And you heard some things. I didn't hear anything at all about Andrew John Gibson having any type of medical background, any type of surgical understanding. Jack the Ripper cut organs out of people, and Andrew John Gibson was 20 years old. I didn't hear anything about him being a butcher or something like that, or having familiarity with handling a knife regularly. Even a suspect like Chaim Hyams wasn't a butcher or a medical doctor, but he was a cigar maker, and he was cutting tobacco with a knife all day. He would have been very good with a knife. So I think that these cases are kind of created by people who maybe just wanted to use the name of Jack the Ripper to spread the story in an inappropriate direction. But that's just my take on the subject. What do you think about everything? Did you hear anything about John George Gibson or Andrew John Gibson that made you suspicious about them being Jack the Ripper? I tried my best to list off the strong points and the weaker points, and that's what I like to do here on Ripper Wednesday. And I will be with you guys later today for the double event, and that will be all for me now. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is Ned Dahan. I also have BlackboxNed88 on Instagram, BlackboxNed88 on TikTok, and I will see you later today. Until next time.